the second draft I weave them together. So when I came to write the chapters from the point of view of this nasty character, I had to stay in his company, kind of under his skin, for day after day after day, and it gave me huge respect for writers like Val McDermott, who do this for a living all the time. I don't really want to write a nasty person again for a while. His name is Modest Carlson. Only that's not his real name, it's a name he made up in prison. He was sent to prison for raping a schoolgirl in his charge, and while in prison he was visited by a creative writing teacher, in a rather sweet way that creative writing teachers do in prison, and encouraged to write about his pain and his story, and he just took the opportunity to make up a whole new life for himself, including the name Modest Carlson. When he's first released from prison, he, on impulse, settles in a rather grim place called Portsmouth in the south of England, not far from where I grew up. And he takes on a dilapidated second-hand bookshop and makes a rather grimy living there, selling second-hand books and vintage pornography under the counter. And he is beaten up by some drunken sailors, and his life is saved by a young priest, who we realise quite quickly is actually Barnaby Johnson, the hero of the novel. And he doesn't see the priest's face because his eyes are full of blood, but he picks up on his voice, and he is given a handkerchief by the priest to mop his wounds with. And when he comes to in the hospital, he finds his handkerchief has the letter B on it. And so for several weeks afterwards, Modest Carlson obsessively goes to church, a different church every Sunday, in the hope of tracking down the priest and giving him back the handkerchief. And in this scene, he has finally tracked him down to a rather grim little Victorian church in a side street. The priest was by some way the youngest person in the room, so even had he not been good-looking, his presence would have carried a certain charge. Modest was immune to male beauty. What he found compelling was vulnerability. From the moment he began to give out suitably threadbare parish notices, young Mr. Johnson was laying himself wide open to mockery. The other priests Modest had been studying on Sundays past were absurd sometimes, often even, with their robes and posturing and portentousness. Most drew a defensive haughtiness about them, as though judging before they be judged. This man, by contrast, gave the impression of having no such defensive lair, but radiated an innocent certainty. His was the unquestioning belief of a child, like belief in Father Christmas, or fairies, or a mother's beauty, or a father's love. This was belief that compelled one to follow, because to do otherwise would be a kind of cruelty. As the service began in earnest with a hymn, and the priest processed in, fully robed, with one elderly acolyte carrying a cross before him, and another bringing up the rear, Modest glanced around and saw that the people there loved their vicar. Man and woman alike stole shy glances at Mr. Johnson as he passed them, and stared boldly at him once he was before them. With his robes, he had not assumed pomposity, like the prison chaplain, or the priest in the hideous council estate church Modest had attended the previous week. He merely assumed an utterly sincere solemnity. He was, Modest decided, like a considerate child who had begun performing a magic trick only to discover that the magic was real and possibly dangerous. One could imagine him, resolute yet terrified, conducting an exorcism. His voice, unquestionably the same he had heard from the gutter that terrible night, filled him with an unsettling desire to confess all and be absolved. As they were filing out and handing back their prayer books and hymnals, the flower arranger greeted him again. "That was a good service," he told her. "We're lucky to have him," she said. "I'm sorry, what was your vicar's first name again?" he asked, although she hadn't said. "Barnaby," she said. "Barnaby Johnson. I hope we'll see you again." As at the altar rail, he managed to be the last in line at the door. Before he shook Johnson's hand, he handed him back the handkerchief. It was immediately evident that Johnson remembered the incident, but not the face that went with it. "How are you?" he asked, concerned. "I should have recognized you straight away. Perhaps with a bloody nose I'd have looked more familiar," Modest said, and they shared a laugh. "Let me introduce you," the priest said. "This is Patience, who's attended this church all her life, so can always tell me who people are or where things belong." "How do you do?" said an elegant old woman with a purple summer coat. "What's your name?" "Modest," he told her. "Modest Carlson." "Of course it is," Mr. Johnson said. "I remember now. You had a Swedish father and a Russian mother." "Full marks," Modest said, and they laughed again. "Well, I do hope you come back," Mr. Johnson added, "now that you know where we are. Patience will show you the ropes. She knows everything about everybody." The old woman clucked to herself and batted a hand at him, so it was plain she was as deeply in love as the rest of them. Mr. Johnson had slipped away, evidently adept at parishioner evasion. The old woman had fixed on Barnaby a gaze of comfortless inquiry. "Would you care for a sherry?" she asked. Modest noticed her magnificent amethyst brooch and accepted. Patience, Miss Boyle, lived in a house that would easily have accommodated a family of 6. She lived alone, curator to what was, in effect, a museum to her parents. Born to expect more out of life than Portsmouth, her mother had married a dashing naval officer and somehow become stranded there on his death. She had left their sole child not only the guardian of a house full of treasures and memories, but the sole repository of a lifetime of prejudice and suspicion. Bitter in outlook and acid of tongue, Patience Boyle had not been granted even the compensation of a husband and children, and now had no friends. "We have a friend in Jesus," she told Modest with startlingly naked cynicism. She appeared to accept him entirely at face value. It also seemed that, for all his carefulness, she recognized in him a kindred spirit, another lost soul. He grew pleasantly dizzy on her excellent wine society sherry, while she regaled him with unflattering portraits of every member of the congregation. All were found to be hypocrites in some way or other, neither as sweet nor as pious as they first appeared. "It's a good thing you found me first," she said. "Saved you so much time and effort." Only young Mr. Johnson was spared her judgment. Anyone can see he's the real thing. Far too good for us to hold on to him for long. Not like Mr. Xavier. She made a face. "Who was he?" he prompted. Another priest. Ghastly little man. Quite ghastly. You'll meet him before too long. Breath that would bring down a bustard. She made him share a tin of the better quality chicken soup, to which he added yet more sherry and a carton of cream, then sent him on his way with the odd sensation that, although she had asked him not one question, he had just made a friend. It was no road to Damascus moment. He didn't change perceptibly. He continued to run the shop, making his best money from selling pornography snatched from the shamefaced and first editions tricked from the innocent. He continued to drink heavily and to lead a life of barely concealed squalor. All that had altered was that he now attended church and, with the minimum of effort it seemed to him, sustained a friendship. He attended on Sundays, sitting within glancing distance of Patience, but not with her. But he soon began also to attend occasional morning and evening services, the stripped-down ones without time-consuming music, at which he was frequently the only person present, besides the young priest. If Mr. Johnson was surprised to see him, he didn't show it, which gave Modest a powerful sense of these morning and evening offices being observed for their own sake, inexorable as the motions of sun and moon, regardless of who watched them. It was as though, assisted by the priest, the dour, undistinguished building were praying to itself. He took the opportunities these services afforded to watch Barnaby Johnson openly, to notice his very clean nails and clumsily cut hair, the way there was often a catch in his voice when he said the grace. There was nearly always a small red book about him, either in his hands or on his prayer stool, or, when he was in his civilian clothes, jutting out of his jacket pocket. Modest itched to ask him what it was, or even to pick it up and hold it for himself. It was not a Bible or a psalter, and he had never seen him read from it, yet it was plainly important to him. Sometimes Johnson spoke with him briefly afterwards. More often, he hurried off about his work. "I'm glad Patience has found you," he confided one morning. "You're doing her good." This made Modest realise she was a parish burden, prickly, difficult, a source of guilt to the kinder souls who failed to love her. And that in turn led him to see how effortlessly he might become such a burden too, unloved, unlovable, yet ineluctably amongst them, a moist, secretive toad. And how all around might continue to be repelled and to turn aside, yet God and this young man, his vulnerable avatar, were compelled repeatedly to forgive and welcome him. Well, this is the bit I enjoy. Now we get to the bit I enjoy, which is where I stop talking at you and talk with you. But that needs one of you to ask a question to set the conversation going. I'm told you're not a shy audience here at all, so you go for it.
And the scene where Lenny slips the drug into the water and drinks it, it seems to be very intense in the sense that he doesn't know the Barnaby is his father.
Oh, don't give away the plot. There might be somebody who doesn't know.
sorry,
No.
be a spoiler on it, but that just seems so intense that, and also the fact that family-like connection, that blood connection, and also then the fact that he's a religious man, and whether or not he agrees with assisted suicide, or there's an awful lot going on there in that particular scene that seems to be very intense and so interesting to explore all the different feelings between both men.
Yes, and funnily enough, that first chapter, for those of you who haven't read the book, it begins with a rather shocking scene where a young man called Lenny, who's in a wheelchair after a rugby accident, who knows he'll never walk again, calls Barnaby, the parish priest, to visit him in Penzance and commit suicide in front of him, which sort of sets in motion the plot in a way. And I first wrote that not knowing it was going to be part of a novel. I was inspired by a real life story of a young man called Daniel James, who was rendered totally paralyzed. He was quadriplegic after a rugby accident. And he notoriously persuaded his parents to take him to Switzerland, Dignitas, to die. And I was terribly moved by that story and realised that the parents must have loved him enormously to be able to suppress their own love and their own instincts to the extent of giving him what he wanted. And I just wrote what I thought might just be a short story. But then I found I was obsessing about what the relationship must be between the priest. So when I first wrote it, I didn't know there was any link between them at all. I just hinted at it. And then I realised there must be a link, and I was wondering about it and wondering what their individual journeys had been that brought them to that moment. And that's when I realised, okay, this is turning into a book.
Yeah, it's really... what I loved about it was the fact that everything connects, like the different characters, main characters, like they all have they interweave with each other's lives through the book, which is it's lovely way to just kind of all clicks together.
Well, it's quite a cruel book in that there are certain points in it when I think the reader is brought up short by a revelation,
yeah, exactly.
And a lot of readers have said, I cursed you because I had to keep going back and reading bits again to see if I'd missed something. And I was telling a friend here earlier that a friend of mine was on the London Underground a few months ago and couldn't resist getting out his iPhone because he saw a woman in front of him was reading A Perfectly Good Man. And he thought, oh, what fun, I'll just film her and then I can email a little bit of film to Patrick. Woman in public reading your book. And just at the moment when he started filming her, she suddenly cursed really loudly and threw the book into her shopping bag. And he caught her eye and said, you've got to that bit, haven't you? And she said, yes, I have, and I'm very cross. But I was thrilled because I love it when people are upset or made angry by something I've written, because then I know it's got to them on some level.
Sorry, as you mentioned that, I think there was Carlson bit that I really turned against him was, although he was actually no more a paedophile than he was a murderer, or habitually a rapist, that habitually got me. It was like, it's all right if you don't do it very often.
Just occasionally.
It's like,
yes.
daily,
But it's funny, that passage fooled a lot of readers. I've had a lot of readers coming up and saying, but of course, Modest didn't actually rape her, did he?
Oh, he did.
And they've been led astray by his pleading on his own behalf, and the way he has kidded himself.
But I thought it was very...
But it's quite, it does... And it creates a certain tension as well, because I think you then worry all the way through. I mean, I worried as I was writing it that Wallace was going to do something horrible. And I kept worrying he might find himself alone with one of